Welcome to the I Speak Fundy Biosphere series. We want to become more fluent when speaking about the Fundy Biosphere. In this series, we'll be covering everything from the sciences of ecology and forestry to climate action and even hiking, exploring, and tourism. Join us as together we learn how truly special the Fundy Biosphere is. Hey, just wanted to pop in here before the episode starts. We had a few connectivity issues here, but there's some really great information about invasive species in here. Huge thanks to Kristen and the NB Invasive Species Council. Welcome to the Fundy Biosphere I Speak series. I'm Ben Cummings, and today I have with me Kristen Elton, the director of New Brunswick Invasive Species Council. Kristen, how you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing wonderful. So tell me a little bit about your organization. What do you do, and how long have you sort of been dealing with invasive species?
Yeah, absolutely. So the New Brunswick Invasive Species Council is a network of people who have a vested interest in invasive species issue in the province, whether it's government, land managers, recreational users. And basically the objective of the organization is to increase collaboration and coordination on invasive species management issues in the province. There are different groups, different organizations doing different initiatives, but a lot of the times they tend to be disjointed or separate from each other. So we just want to make sure everyone's kind of on the same page so that we can be as efficient and effective as possible when it comes to protecting our natural spaces here in the province from these invaders. And the organization originally kind of came together in around 2009. It was active for a little while, but then momentum kind of died down. And I think really up until recently, invasive species haven't been on a lot of people's radar at the same way they have been in other jurisdictions. But we unfortunately, well, it's a double-edged sword. Fortunately, interest is peaking again. People are becoming more aware of this issue, but the reason it is because we are getting a few more invasives that are causing some issues. So in around 2018, 2019, a couple of the people who had been part of the original group submitted some funding applications, and I came on the project in August of 2019. And since then, we have been running and going full speed. It has kind of been like jumping on a treadmill that's already going. Now that invasive species are on the map, people are starting. There's an appetite to do something about it. So we've been moving quickly, we've been growing quickly, and it's great because we do really rely on a lot of that interest in the collaboration with other different groups. So right now we just brought on 2 additional new staff, so really excited to see where we go in the next couple of years.
It's unfortunate that it's something that has to be talked about, but it's great that there is an organization that's actually dealing with it, and that you've been able to hire, like you say, hire a couple of staff that can help and sort of bring a lot more light to the subject. So before we start, I'm really curious about what invasive species we have around, but how do you classify an invasive species?
So that's a really good question. And there is definitely some confusion. So an invasive species generally has to meet, we say there's 3 criteria, 3 boxes something has to check off for us to consider invasive. The first is that it's a non-native species, so it's not from here originally. The second is that it spreads quickly, it reproduces quickly, and it's hard to control the population. And the third is that it causes some harm in some way. And that harm could be to the environment, to the economy, to human health, the way we use our waterways. And, for something to be considered invasive, we want it to meet all those 3 criteria. So a really good distinction here is we think of poison ivy, and no one's going to argue that poison ivy is good. We certainly don't like it. It is harmful, but poison ivy is a native species. It does work kind of in balance with the environment around it. So poison ivy is not an invasive species. We think about tomatoes, right? Tomatoes are not a native species to North America, but they're also not invasive because anybody who's gardened knows you need to give a lot of tender care to those tomatoes for them to be successful. So, if we were to leave tomatoes alone, they're not going to escape and run rampant and take over our forests. So even though that's not a native species, it's also not an invasive species. Now, the classic example of an invasive species I always go to is zebra mussels, which have caused devastating effects in the Great Lakes and throughout Canada, other jurisdictions in Canada and the US. They're not from here. They're native to the Black and Caspian Seas over in Europe. They spread in crazy numbers, and they cause extensive damage to the ecosystems and the economy. So by ticking off those 3 boxes, we call that an invasive species. And one that a lot of people, comes up as an example here that there's some confusion about is cyanobacteria and blue-green algae. A lot of people will say they'll misidentify that as an invasive species because we're seeing it pop up in more places. That's actually a species. Cyanobacteria is all around us, and that species that unfortunately creates the toxin is native to this area. The reason we're seeing more of it is simply because the conditions are better suited to it growing and thriving with increasing water temperatures, nutrient loads, and that kind of thing. And no one would argue that it's not harmful. It's certainly an issue that we need to deal with, but it's not an invasive species issue. So overall, if it's non-native, spreads rapidly, and causes damage in some way, that's what we consider something an invasive species.
And I think it's interesting that a lot of people, when you think or when you hear invasive species, you're prone to think plants, right? You're prone to think flora, whereas they can also, I like the example of the zebra mussels, that they can also be an animal, or like you say, they could be some type of bacteria or fungi or something, as long as they're not native to the area. So what are some of the ones that we are dealing with here in New Brunswick, or even specifically in the Fundy region?
Well, you bring up a really good point. It's not just plants. An invasive species can be a plant, an animal, or a pathogen. So it could be a fungus, it could be bacteria or a virus. So some of the ones that we're dealing with, on the plant side of things, we've got woodland angelica that is invading through the St. John River Basin. Starting to see it in other places. It's a similar plant. It's in the wild carrot family. It grows these really tall stalks with the big white flowers. A lot of people confuse it for giant hogweed, which is also an invasive species. It's the one that causes the severe burns if you come in contact with it. We do have a few patches of that in the province, but they're pretty isolated to the southwest. But people have probably seen woodland angelica. Another plant I know you guys talked on the previous episode was Japanese knotweed, the bane of everybody's existence. Glossy buckthorn is another one. It's a woody shrub that's getting into our forests and really, really taking over. And the problem with that one is that all those berries on that tree produces very tasty to birds, and they eat it and then they go and spread it further. So it's popping up in places that people aren't even connected to. Yeah. In the water, we also have some aquatic plants, and one that we're particularly targeting is Eurasian water milfoil. And this is a plant that grows from the bottom in big tall columns, and it so much of it grows, it creates these big thick mats to the point where you can barely get a paddle through areas that it's growing in. So unfortunately, that was first detected in the St. John River in 2015 around Fredericton at just a couple sites. And now we see it Woodstock down to the St. John Harbor. So that's one that we're really, really concerned about, trying to prevent the spread of it getting to our lakes, because as I said, it just drastically changes what those lakes are looking like. On the animal side of things, we've got the zebra mussels. That's one that we're really, really concerned about getting into the province. We don't have them here, knock on wood. We want to keep it that way. But everyone might be familiar with another invertebrate, the European green crab. If anybody's spent any time along the shoreline down in Fundy, on the Gulf side as well, you'll see them. They're a tiny little crab that you're more likely to see them than you are to see our native crabs in some areas. Wow. And they've got really big appetites. They're bullies. They're much more aggressive than some of our native crabs, and they do a lot of damage to our eelgrass beds, which are really critical habitat for a lot of species in the region. They don't eat the eelgrass; they just tear it up looking for other food. So, there's some projects underway looking at how to restore those areas. We look at some fish species that are technically invasive: largemouth bass, chain pickerel, smallmouth bass in some areas. In some places, these fish were introduced 100 years ago, so they've kind of naturalized in some areas, but it's when they're the damage has already been done there. Yeah. It's getting them into new areas that's the problem we don't want to see. And then there's some common ones that people don't realize are actually invasive. So European starlings are a bird that everybody has seen, and they are technically an invasive species. They were introduced by some into Hyde Park and work into North America. So he brought a couple dozen starlings, and now there's billions of them across the continent. But another one that I always like to point out, because it's one that we've seen the impact of here in the Maritimes, is actually in our bats. Though the Maritimes population of bats has decreased by about 90%. And it's mostly due to this fungus that causes white nose syndrome in our caves. And the fungus that causes that is an introduced fungus from another area of the world that is thought to have got here from contaminated caving equipment. So, somebody was caving in an area of the world where that fungus was native, came to a cave. I believe they've kind of narrowed it down to an area, kind of ground zero in New York State. That fungus transferred from their equipment to that cave, and now it's spreading across the continent, and it's decimating our bat populations. So that's a good example of a pathogen, of a fungus that is an invader that is causing astronomical changes to the ecosystem, given the important function that bats have. I could go on and on with different examples of invasive. We've got lots of battles. But the other one I would really want to point out, particularly in the region that you guys do a lot of work in, is actually invasive Phragmites, which is a tall plant. A common reed is the other name for it. You'll see it in the Moncton region, coming in through the Tantramar region from Nova Scotia, growing along roadways, in the middle of roadways. So it's a wetland plant, but it really likes those ditches. And this is a plant that gets into wetland areas, just completely takes over you, and there's no room for any other plant species. And unfortunately, in Ontario, it has caused tremendous damage to places like Long Point, another biosphere reserve, I believe. And we do have that creeping into the province in a couple places here, particularly from the Nova Scotia side. So that is one that we also are trying to do a bit of work around to prevent it getting any further in, because it does have the potential to do quite a bit of damage.
So what are some of the policies, or even what are some people doing to eradicate, or even are we addressing a lot of these invasive species?
Well, that's part of what our objective is as an organization, is to try and get more of those policies in place, more of this on the ground. We can actually get some work done on them. A lot of different groups, like the Nature Conservancy of Canada, the Nature Trust of New Brunswick, even different, like the Natural Resources Department at the province, Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Everybody's doing these different things within their own little realm. But we've got one of the biggest things that we're doing on an awareness campaign is we have these different behavioral change programs that address the way that people are moving around, and how we can prevent spreading invasive species while we're doing those activities. Because invasive species can't move very far naturally on their own. It's usually they're hitching a ride with us on the things that we do. So what we're doing is trying to create some awareness and let people know that the easy steps that they can take to make sure that they're not bringing along a hitchhiker from Fundy National Park up to Fredericton or vice versa. So one of the ones we have is the Clean Drain Dry program, which is about clean drain drying your boat and aquatic equipment, so that you're not bringing along those aquatic invaders. Buy local, burn local, not moving firewood is a big one that a lot of people might be familiar with, because can be things that we can't really see. A lot of these invaders, the emerald ash borer is another big one that unfortunately has recently been confirmed in multiple places in the province, which poses significant risk, along with gypsy moth. We've got the longhorn pine beetle as well, that pose risk to our forests. So, the reason why we're asking people not to move firewood at all, if they can, is because, they're tiny. We can't always see them. And that's how they're moving around the province. And a lot of people will be familiar when they go to the national park, you're not allowed to bring in firewood. You have to buy it there. A lot of people think that that's just a money grab or a source of funds. It's actually not. That wood that is for sale has been treated at a certain temperature for a certain length of time that guarantees that there are no pests in it that could spread throughout the park. So that is directly a measure to protect the forest of the areas that you're going to visit. And then we also have some campaigns like Don't Let It Loose. So a lot of species, unfortunately, have been introduced to the wild through, people not wanting their pet anymore, so they dump their goldfish in the lake, or they're out west, they have some problems with domestic rabbits, or a big one is red-eared sliders, those little pet turtles that people get when they're small and they don't realize that they're going to grow quite large and live a long time, and they can pose a pretty big threat to native turtle populations. Not just if they survive, they become a competitor for food and resources, but they can also introduce diseases to that environment that they're released into. A lot of it comes down to education. A lot of people, when you start having the conversations with them, they realize like, oh, that totally makes sense, that when I'm going hiking, I get seeds on my shoes and in the treads of my boots, and then when I go to the next trail, those seeds fall off and I can be spreading a plant. Like, yeah, that makes total sense, but until it's pointed out, it's not something people tend to think about. So we're trying to get a lot of action on the ground where people can start thinking about that stuff in advance. And then we also have other projects are happening throughout the province. Groups are trying to figure out how to effectively get rid of Japanese knotweed, or looking at things like the forest pests. There's a lot of trapping, a lot of monitoring going on to make sure that we're catching these new introductions early, to make sure that we can actually try and do something about them. But really, I mean, it's going to take a huge effort, and that's where that coordination comes in, because we're a small province, we've got limited resources, and we're only going to be effective if we can kind of maximize our utility, really, in how we work together on fighting these things.
Well, and like you say, it's a large part is just the education, because some people may not have the background to be able to think, not necessarily be able to, but just the wherewithal to think about, oh, like you say, you're bringing seeds or you're bringing spores, or there can be a lot of things that you just don't know about and you're just ignorant to, which hopefully we can help raise awareness to. And I'd love for you to send me some pictures too of some of the things we've talked about, so that we can point them out, which would be really cool, and we can share them on our pages as well. But Kristen, thank you so much. This was really cool. I'm glad I've definitely learned some things too, and hopefully some of our listeners did as well.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. So thank you for listening. I hope you learned something, and we will see you in the next podcast. For more information about the Fundy Biosphere, or to contact us, you can find us on social media or visit us at fundy-biosphere.ca.